Welcome to Insight, a series exploring the deeper philosophies of renowned traditional martial artists, hosted by Ray Hughes, a martial artist with 50 years of experience.
Hey, welcome to the show. Today is part two of a two-part conversation with Sensei Lee Gray, an 85-year-old martial artist who started his training in 1960 in Okinawa while serving in the Marine Corps. Today he discussed retiring from the Marines, moving back to Amarillo, and becoming a prison guard in the psychiatric ward. Obviously a place that requires true martial arts skills, obviously. Also, you can feel his struggles when we start discussing about sport competition, because Sensei Gray is a fanatical traditional martial artist. So with that, Sensei Lee Gray. Okay, so then what happens there? You're in the mid-80s, early 80s, and you run a school. How long did that go?
The latter part of the 80s, maybe early 90s. My mother contracted Alzheimer's, and my dad was having a hard time, both dealing with that and dealing with her, needed help. So he called me and asked me if I could come back. So I packed my bags and moved back here to Amarillo.
And that was about, what, late 80s then?
Late 80s, yeah, maybe.
Early 90s?
Early 90s, yeah. Looked for a job here, and employment opportunities were still very strong in agriculture and so forth, but they had built a prison in Amarillo, and so I figured that I could fit in that environment. And so
you became a prisoner?
Yeah, I applied and became a prison guard.
Now, how was that experience?
Well, unique. Don't recommend it, but the prison system learned about my background. And I started teaching in my off hours out in town also. I worked in the psychiatric ward. They had a program called PAMIO, Program for Aggressive Mentally Ill Offenders. They wanted correctional officers that worked in that area to be able to protect themselves because all of these offenders were proven aggressive. That's how they wound up in this program. So they had a civilian who was trying to teach a variation of Aikido to these guys. I attended a class that one of our wardens was trying to teach out of a manual, and he got frustrated, and he said and the manual had all of the Japanese terms, Ikkyo and Nikyo, and a lot of the Japanese terms for Aikido in there. And he was trying to enunciate them, and he literally said, "Does anybody understand what this stuff is?" And so I kind of raised my hand. I said, "Yeah." I said, "I think this is what you're trying to say." And he said, "Come here." So I went up, and he had this lesson plan laid out, and I started reading through it, and I understood what they were trying to teach. And he said, do you know anything about this? And I said, a little. And he said, "Can you teach it?" And I said, "I can." I said, "But can I show you something different?" And he said, "By all means, please." And so that's where it picked up from there. I said, TDC wide, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice wide, had a defensive tactics program going on, but it was inadequate and difficult to learn. Wasn't simple. They approached me and they said, "Can we do better than what we're doing?" I said, "Absolutely." They also had a guy down in Huntsville who was a Kyokushinkai karate instructor named Jimmy Fields. They asked for my input. They asked for his input. And we put together a program that was more karate-based and was a little more direct, a little simpler. Where a correctional officer under attack by one or two or three or four people could protect himself using blocks and by body positioning and moving and manipulate himself into out of a situation that could get him hurt. It doesn't mean that you got five guys trying to beat you up, you're going to get beat up. But we wanted to help people have at least some source of protection. So we started teaching this in a program statewide. And for a long time, it stayed part of their regular curriculum. And when people went through the academy to become correctional officers, they were taught that program.
I would imagine that real situation would show the weaknesses of karate training when applied to real life. I would imagine that became obviously real quick.
Well, it did. It helped you understand in real combat. Combat and sport karate are two different things.
Absolutely.
And I'm not saying that a good sports fighter would get hurt in a real fight in the street, because a good sports fighter is going to be able to protect himself and keep himself from getting hurt. But in real combat situations, when you're not dealing just with a one-on-one individual, when you've got groups of people who are trying to not just hurt you but kill you,
Right, right.
you've got to be serious, and you've got to understand uh, some of the deeper elements of karate, the transference of power, and you've got to make contact with an individual, not just to be able to score on him or to knock him away from you, but to hurt him in the process.
Right.
So your goal becomes not just to interface with the guy in a sportsmanship manner. It becomes, either I'm going to hurt you to keep you from hurting me.
I would imagine that really influenced your karate teaching in regular public schools, I would imagine.
Yes, it did. It influenced my teaching, and it's drawn me away from the tournament atmosphere. However, when I started teaching, after I retired from TTCJ and started teaching here commercially, again, people were interested in competitions. As a matter of fact, you came to Amarillo to one of the tournaments I held.
Right.
And so I was more or less forced to teach the competition side of it. But there are people who had an interest in protecting themselves in a real situation also. When COVID hit and I quit teaching commercially, dojo I've built behind my house, the handful of students that I have now are more interested in martial art aspect, the real martial art aspect of karate, and two, the benefits, the physical and the health benefits that provides for you.
I have been in probably, I'd say, a half a dozen rural fights in my life, and that was in my 20s and early 30s. And those real fights are not like the dojo. They are completely different. The chaos, the craziness, the loss of vision and stuff. But that little bit of experience influenced my teaching. So even during teaching sport, because a lot of the young people like sport, you could always rely back on, just remember, there's nobody saying yame in the middle of a fight.
Right.
Were you philosophical in those kinds of teachings in your school?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to tell them that, there's always a plan B. You better have a backup. And when it's working for you, you don't stop. You don't quit. There's no, if this guy is hurt, you continue to make sure that he's not going to come back. He's not going to, we're not looking to kill anybody, but we're looking to make sure that he's not going to come, you stop hitting him, he's going to start hitting you again. You want to make sure that he's finished in the fight. I call it a complete finish. There has to be a complete finish to the fight. And there's only one complete finish. Either you're completely done or he is completely done. If he's not completely done, then the fight's not over. And you never want to be completely done.
Yeah. Now, Sensei, you also study sword. How did that come together?
Well, it's interesting how I got into sword. I may have given you a kind of a misnomer earlier, because I did get into Kobudo in Okinawa also.
Oh, okay.
And I ran across a guy here in Amarillo who had a martial arts school, and he was advertising Yaijitsu. So I stopped in to talk to him to see, what his link was. And he didn't know much about Yaijitsu. He said, but I have a friend or an acquaintance, a guy I know that he's in Lubbock, Lubbock is about an hour drive away from Amarillo. He comes up and shows me some stuff, and I try to pass it on to my students up here. And I said, well, let me know when this guy shows up. And so he called me, and I went up and met him, a guy named Walt Bushy. And Walt was a student of a man named Komi Sekiguchi, I'm sorry. It's Texas accent got in there. Sekiguchi Sensei was the head of Muso Jikiden Nation Ryu School in Japan. And Walt Bushi brought him to the United States 3 or 4 times a year. I started training with Walt, and when Sekiguchi Sensei would come, I would train with him. Late 1900s, early 20s.
Okay.
maybe.
But you had studied some Kobudo, you said, while you were in
Yeah,
Okinawa.
I'd studied Kobudo in Okinawa with Matoshi Sensei. Actually, I even learned Kobudo kata from Shinkantara. Learned it. So I kind of considered Shinjo Sensei was not interested really in Kobudo. His philosophy was do karate, pick up a stick and do karate. To some extent, that's what Kobudo was about, really,
Yeah, yeah.
truly, And my interest in Yai was to see how Kobudo worked against the sword.
Right, right.
And it was kind of interesting to try to think, well, how would I use a sai in this particular instance or a tonfa against this kind of assault? And I know that Minobu Miki and Takeru Hayashi both, and Miki has gone on to really advance his understanding of sword training in San Diego and has a large following there. So that was my real interest in learning about sword techniques and how they could complement what I was doing. I stopped doing it because it was so much different than karate. I didn't like the influence it was putting on my karate. And so instead of spending all of that time, something that I just had a casual interest in, I stopped. And so I really don't say that I do sword anymore at all.
Now, do you still teach Kobudo?
I do still, if I have a student has an interest,
Right.
I will teach them Kobudo. But I find a lot of people are not interested in Kobudo at all.
You know what? We could not get enough interest in our schools here in Arizona for Kobudo. You'd get one or two,
Yeah.
but out of 300-400 students, you'd think you'd get 30, but I just don't. And then there's a couple of schools by us that were nothing but Kobudo. And I was trying to figure out, how did they do this?
Yeah. My friend Kimo Wall, also
Yes.
a Goju practitioner, but his major emphasis was Kobudo. Before he passed, his time was spent just traveling from dojo to dojo to dojo, teaching Kobudo to people. He would stop off here and spend a week or two with me, and I would brush up on my Kobudo with him, and then he would move on. There is it seems like one or the other. Either your main interest lies in karate or it lies in Kobudo, and there's no balance between the two of them. Even Kanai Sensei, who was a contemporary of Shinjo, who also taught Kobudo, the emphasis in his dojo was more on Kobudo than it was on Goju. And Mateoshi Sensei was very knowledgeable in karate, probably one of the most knowledgeable individuals about karate that I have ever met, about Okinawa karate that I've ever met. But still, his emphasis was in Kobudo. And Shinkantara is the same way. Very knowledgeable in Shonryu karate, but his emphasis was in Kobudo.
Interesting. Now, are you part of an organization, or are you an independent Goju practitioner?
I'm part of the Shobukan organization here in the United States. They recognize me. We do things a little differently, simply because I'm stuck with what Shinjo Sensei taught me, and he has passed on, and his son Masashi has taken over the organization. And Masashi has, changed anything, but his take on things is different than what mine is, and the way I learn. So he's asked me to do the best I can to try to to do what they are doing, and I just can't do it. So do I favor the Shobukan organization? Yes. Do I try to influence it? No, I don't.
It's funny because we became independent about, I'd say, 15 years ago. We had it with the organization that we were part of. And then recently joined WIKF, Suzuki's organization. But there's no way I can memorize their curriculum. I'm just too old. I can't remember. So it's so funny how what you were taught in the early years sticks with you all the way through. It's hard to change.
Yeah. Yeah, it is hard to change. And I could go to Okinawa and train at Shobukan headquarters and be welcome there with no problems whatsoever. And any Shobukan function that happens in the United States, I know that I am welcome at. But we have a different eye. So I stay abreast, friends that are part of the U.S. Shobukan organization and guys that I admire. And they're welcome to come and train with me anytime. And I know that it's a reciprocity that I could go there when the politics starts. Shut up. Just
Yeah, that's I hate to say this. I didn't learn to deal with politics until probably 20 years ago when I finally realized to shut up, not say nothing, keep my head down, you know.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and then it became easy. Before I always try to voice my opinion, and yeah, I guess that's one of the few benefits of getting older, right, Sensei? You know when to get involved or not. Well, what's your philosophy about today's traditional martial arts? Have we lost our way, or are we holding our own? Because the world is definitely changing.
Definitely. And I think there are pockets of genuine, real karate out there. I think they are. Their guys are more or less doing what I'm doing, training in their garage or in a little place that they have set up and are teaching a few people. I think that tournament karate is certainly on the decline. They're not big tournaments like there used to be and so forth. I think the politics has killed tournament karate. Yeah, I think there's karate is still alive and well and still out there. You've got to go look for it. Exactly.
It's funny about competition. The problem with competition, and I support competition. I think there's a place for it, especially for our youth and stuff. But the problem with competition, at least from my point of view, is it brings out the worst in the human condition, worst of mankind, because the outrage and the fighting and the angry and the politics, it's just, that's the downside of any sport, not just martial art, but any sport.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know how you contain that animal, because,
Well,
as a
you
martial
can't.
artist.
You can't. It's just one of those things. And I just got sick of it. And so I quit going.
Well, what
And I
I
didn't
did in
have
my,
to anymore. My students weren't interested in it.
yeah,
And and to a certain extent, if you are teaching in a commercial basis, you have to provide your students with what they wanted. And I did.
exactly right.
The,
Exactly right.
particularly for children, parents wanted to see them to be able to compete and so forth. And we are a competitive nation,
Right.
and all of our athletic activities are not singular. They are competitive.
Mhm.
Baseball, football, basketball, all of that. So we're as a society are oriented that way. Even boxing, which is a singular training sort of deal, and gymnastics, which is a singular training sort of thing, is still looked at as a competitive thing. So if you're going to teach commercially, you're going to have to keep your customers, for lack of a better phrase,
Mhm.
happy for a while. And you and I ran across each other on several occasions at
Absolutely.
so on. But I was never happy about it. It never was not really what I wanted to do.
Well, when you started in Okinawa, did they have competitions back in the 60s?
No, no, there was.
Yeah,
Uh, the competitions were fistfights for real. There was no sporting aspect of it at all. And back in the day when competition first started in the United States, I heard individuals make claims of being the all Okinawa karate champion and all of that kind of stuff. And I'd kind of snicker at that because I knew there was no competition in Okinawa. Now that's not the case. There is. Of course, Okinawa is again now a part of Japan. That happened in
yeah.
78, I think. I was on the island when it happened, I remember. And so I find it strange that at least for a while, Japanese karate influenced Okinawa karate. And certainly from a sports standpoint, a couple of the major Japanese organizations have a huge influence in certain areas of Okinawa
Yeah.
now versus the other way around, which is what I would have suspected would have happened, that the Japanese would say, well, let's go find out what the real source is. But that didn't happen that way.
The when you run an organization, commercial school or an organization, I think you have to have competition, and it's mostly for the young people, yeah, also young coaches, because I'm sure you're the same as I. When you get to a certain age, competition is not important, and the art becomes important more than that. But when you're in your 20s and 30s and you're a coach and you got a bunch of kids, that. So what I guess what I'm saying is an organization, you got to have compartments, competition for this age group.
Yeah, you're correct. And like you said, sport karate has its place. It definitely does. But we can't confuse it with, for lack of a better term, traditional karate. You can't, you have to look at it as a separate sort of thing.
Well, the other thing for me is I think if you're a teacher, you have to constantly be reminding the student base of what in competition that can help you in self-defense, dealing with stress, strategy, training and stuff. So you're constantly bringing back philosophically competition can help for a real fight. Because if you get away with it and all you're talking about is the sport, you've lost your way.
Yes.
Like for instance, in my school, before I retired, the people that were the non-athletes and stuff, I was trying to get them to compete because they need it. But the parents didn't want their kids to compete because they're not going to win. I said, forget the winning. You need to go get stressed, get out there, and it's the closest you can get to a fight. But
we
I wasn't good.
We try to create that stress and that intensity in the training through exercises and through oyo, the practice of oyo, and what the Japanese refer to as ippon kumites. And I've seen some Japanese schools have what they call ju ippon kumites also.
Right.
And we've done that for a long time. We just never put a title to it.
Right.
So you can create that atmosphere. You can create that pressure, with my adults as well, with the given understanding that a 50-year-old or a 60-year-old is not going to respond the same way a 14 or 15-year-old is. And you have to take that in account when you're teaching. You can do it just through drills and repeated, because even in sport competition, repetition is what makes you a winner or a loser. So it's the same thing when you're teaching them traditionally. And you're taking that movement out of that kata, showing how it realistically works on the street, and then do that 1,000 times. Just that one movement until your students are sick of it. And then, say, are you ever going to teach me anything else? And then you teach them the counter to it. And so, okay, now do it against the counter.
Sensei, it's funny because most of my show is talking to senior instructors, and that's the theme across everybody I talk to. Is all we did is one thing over and over a million times, and every day was the same practice. And it's funny, back when I competed, we didn't train for tournaments. You just trained your normal training.
Yeah.
And then you went and competed. And whatever happened. And
that's the way I was when I first started competing. If competition in the beginning for me was a way to meet other people who were interested in karate. And I did. I made a lot of friends. But my training never really changed. Right. I got disqualified a lot. But also in the early days of competition, there was that old saying, no blood, no foul. So you'd look to see, is there a red mark? Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a point. And it's going to be a bruise later, but it's a point right now.
Well, too, back in those days, we didn't have any gear.
Yeah, there was
everything
no gear.
Well, Sensei, you're 85. You're still running a little school at your house. What's your final mission in life here as far as a martial artist? What are you trying to accomplish?
Well, I hope to leave behind people who have at least a good understanding of what real martial arts is, and maybe one or two of them will be able to carry it on. I feel an obligation. It's been such an important part of my life and done so many positive things for me in my life. I feel an obligation that somewhere out there that it's going to be the same for somebody else.
Wow. Well, it's funny. We started this as a practice session to see if our equipment worked out, and it turned out to be a really great discussion. First of all, thank you for the honor, Sensei. You're one of the people that I really highly respect. And I respect all the guests I've ever had on the show, but I put you in that league because I remember, like I said earlier, that you were so stoic, very strong. I loved watching your kata back in the day. It was a very different look in the Goju kata than what you see today. I remember you being so much more powerful and strong. I don't see that in today's competition, but I remember that. And then we were fortunate to work together off and on in different areas. And I highly, highly respect you thank you for being on the show.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Ray. And your friendship has always meant a lot to me. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you for joining the show with our discussion with Sensei Lee Gray. My next guest is Sensei Bill Damon. I know I mentioned that on the last podcast that I had. We had a couple of difficulties, challenges with getting two old guys together, getting anything done is sometimes difficult, but we're going to get this taken care of. Sensei Bill Damon is another martial artist who started his training in 1960 in Japan. Another fascinating martial artist. Until then, take care.